The decorated K9 German Shepherd lay motionless in the back corner kennel, his once proud frame now nothing more than fur and bones stretched over defeat. For 18 months, families had walked past Rex without a second glance, choosing playful puppies over the forgotten hero who had saved 47 lives. It wasn't supposed to end this way. The shelter volunteer dropped her clipboard, the metallic clang echoing through the concrete corridors as she stared at the euthanization order in her trembling hands. Rex's execution was scheduled for Monday morning, 72 hours away. Margaret O'Sullivan pressed her weathered palm against the cold metal bars, remembering how her late husband Harold used to look exactly like this broken warrior before he took his own life. She had failed to save one hero. "Get Dr. Hayes on the phone now," she whispered urgently, her voice cracking with desperate determination. What chance did an elderly widow have against a system that threw away its heroes? And why was the shelter manager so eager to see Rex dead? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Margaret Maggie O'Sullivan had never planned to visit the Riverside County Animal Shelter that Tuesday morning. At 68, her days followed a predictable rhythm: coffee at sunrise, tending Harold's memorial garden, and the long, silent hours that stretched between dawn and dusk in their too-quiet house. It had been exactly 1 year since Harold took his final breath in the VA hospital, his purple heart clutched in fingers that never stopped trembling from memories of Vietnam. The shelter sat on the outskirts of town, a low concrete building surrounded by chain-link fencing and the constant chorus of barking dogs. Maggie had driven there on impulse, drawn by a volunteer flyer she'd seen at the grocery store. Senior volunteers needed, it had read, and something about those words resonated with the hollow ache in her chest. After 4 decades as a military nurse, first in Vietnam and later at Walter Reed, she understood the weight of serving others. Perhaps helping abandoned animals could fill the void that Harold's death had carved into her life. The shelter manager, Marcus Wheeler, greeted her with a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was younger than her son would have been, probably early 40s, with the rigid posture of former military. Something about his demeanor reminded her of the administrators who had processed Harold's disability claims, polite but distant, helpful but hurried. "Most of our volunteers work with the adoptable animals," Marcus explained, leading her through the main kennels where families cooed over golden retriever puppies and energetic border collie mixes. "The back section houses our more challenging cases." Maggie noticed how his voice changed when he said challenging, the same tone doctors used when discussing terminal patients. They walked past kennel after kennel of eager faces, dogs pressed against bars, tails wagging frantically, desperate for human connection. The noise was overwhelming, barking, whining, the scrape of claws against concrete, and underneath it all, an undercurrent of desperation that made her chest tighten. But as they moved deeper into the building, the sounds grew quieter. The lighting dimmed. The kennels looked older, grimmer, housing dogs that had given up hope of performance for potential adopters. Senior dogs, mostly, their graying muzzles and cloudy eyes marking them as society's forgotten soldiers. "We don't usually bring volunteers back here," Marcus said, his hand hesitating on a heavy metal door marked Isolation Wing. "Some of these animals have behavioral issues, aggressive tendencies." Maggie's trained eye caught something in his tone, not concern for her safety, but something else. Satisfaction, perhaps, or anticipation. It was the same look she'd seen in young medics who had grown too comfortable with suffering, who had forgotten that every patient deserved dignity in their final moments. "I spent 30 years treating soldiers with PTSD, she said quietly, meeting his gaze. "I don't think an old dog is going to frighten me." Marcus's smile faltered for just a moment before returning. "Of course. Right this way." As the door swung open, the silence hit her like a physical weight. This wasn't just a kennel. It was a tomb for the living. The isolation wing smelled of disinfectant and despair. Maggie's footsteps echoed against concrete walls as Marcus led her past kennel after kennel of silent dogs. These weren't the eager, hopeful animals from the main adoption area. These were the forgotten ones, senior dogs with cloudy eyes, mixed breeds deemed unadoptable, and animals bearing the invisible scars of abandonment and abuse. In the furthest corner, where the fluorescent lights barely penetrated the shadows, lay a German shepherd that made Maggie's breath catch in her throat. The dog was massive even in his diminished state, his black and tan coat dull and patchy, ribs clearly visible beneath loose skin. But it wasn't his physical condition that stopped her cold, it was the way he lay. Perfectly still, head resting on enormous paws, eyes open, but seeing nothing. She had seen that exact posture before, in the psychiatric ward at Walter Reed. "That's Rex," Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral. "Been here 18 months, bit 3 volunteers and a potential adopter. We've tried everything with him." There was something in the way Marcus said, "tried everything," that made Maggie's nursing instincts flare. It sounded less like compassion and more like justification. Rex didn't react to their presence. Most dogs, even the traumatized ones, would at least lift their heads when humans approached. Rex remained motionless, as if he had retreated so far inside himself that the outside world no longer existed. Maggie knelt slowly beside the kennel bars, ignoring Marcus's sharp intake of breath behind her. "Easy, ma'am. He's unpredictable." But Maggie was studying Rex's posture with a trained eye. The way his ears lay flat wasn't aggression. It was hypervigilance disguised as shutdown. His breathing pattern was too controlled, too measured. This wasn't a vicious dog. This was a soldier who had seen too much. "What's his background?" she asked quietly, never taking her eyes off Rex. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Retired police dog. His handler was killed in the line of duty. Department didn't want him back, said he was too unstable for service." Something in Marcus's voice made Maggie glance up sharply. There was an edge there, something personal. But before she could analyze it further, Rex moved for the first time. His head lifted slightly, dark eyes focusing on her face with an intensity that made her heart skip. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two wounded souls recognizing something familiar in the other's pain. "Hello, Rex," Maggie whispered, extending her hand slowly toward the kennel bars. "I see you." The response was immediate and heartbreaking. Rex's tail gave the faintest twitch, not a wag, but an acknowledgement. A sign that somewhere beneath the trauma and abandonment, a spark of the hero still flickered. Marcus stepped closer, his shadow falling across the kennel. "Ma'am, I really don't think—" "How did his handler die?" Maggie interrupted, something in Marcus's body language setting off alarm bells she'd learned to trust after decades in military medicine. The silence stretched too long. When Marcus finally answered, his voice was flat, rehearsed. "Drug bust gone wrong. Rex failed to alert to danger. Good officer died because that dog didn't do his job." But Maggie was watching Rex's reaction to Marcus's voice, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The dog's entire body had gone rigid, not with aggression, but with recognition. Rex knew Marcus, and he was terrified. "I'd like to spend some time with him," Maggie said, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that had once helped her save lives under enemy fire. Alone. Marcus's professional mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something ugly underneath. "Ma'am, shelter policy requires staff supervision with aggressive animals for your safety." "Then I'll wait until your shift ends," Maggie replied calmly, settling herself cross-legged on the concrete floor outside Rex's kennel. At her age, comfort was less important than conviction. "I've got nowhere else to be." She pulled out her cell phone and did something that would change everything. Instead of calling her daughter or her few remaining friends, she called the one person who might have answers about Rex's past, her nephew Danny, who worked dispatch for the county sheriff's department. 20 minutes later, her phone buzzed with a text that made her heart sink. Aunt Maggie, Rex was Officer Jake Coleman's K-9 partner. Jake was killed during a child trafficking bust 18 months ago. Rex was wounded too, but survived. Why are you asking? Maggie looked at Rex with new understanding. This wasn't just an abandoned dog. This was a war veteran suffering from survivor's guilt, dumped in a concrete cell because his PTSD made him inconvenient. She thought of Harold, who had carried similar invisible wounds for 47 years before they finally consumed him. "You tried to save him, didn't you, boy?" she whispered to Rex. "And now they blame you for surviving." Rex's eyes met hers again, and this time she was certain she saw understanding there. They were both carrying the weight of someone they couldn't save. Behind her, Marcus's footsteps retreated down the corridor, but not before she heard him make a phone call in a voice too low to understand. Something cold settled in Maggie's stomach as Rex pressed himself against the back wall of his kennel, as far from the sound of Marcus's voice as possible. By Wednesday morning, Maggie had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. She sat in her kitchen, Harold's Purple Heart gleaming on the table beside a stack of financial documents, as she dialed the number for her bank's reverse mortgage department. At 68, with a fixed income of $1,800 a month, she was about to bet everything on a traumatized dog that nobody wanted. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I need to be clear about the risks," Loan Officer Patricia Chen explained over the phone. "A reverse mortgage against your home's equity gives you access to funds now, but you'll lose ownership when you pass away. Are you certain this is for a necessary medical expense?" Maggie looked at the framed photo of Harold in his dress blues, remembering how he'd enlisted at 17 despite his mother's tears. "Some things are worth more than security, dear." "How long until the funds are available?" 3 to 5 business days for approval, then too long. Maggie hung up and reached for her emergency fund, the $8,000 from Harold's life insurance that she'd been saving for her own end-of-life care. Rex didn't have business days. According to the county regulations Danny had sent her, dogs with aggressive incidents had a maximum 72-hour hold before mandatory euthanization. The clock was already ticking. At the shelter, Maggie found Rex in the same position as the day before, but something had changed. His food bowl sat untouched, and the water dish showed only the barest evidence of drinking. Marcus emerged from his office with a clipboard and that same professional smile that made her skin crawl. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'm afraid there's been another incident," he said, consulting his papers with theatrical concern. "Rex attacked a maintenance worker yesterday evening, completely unprovoked. The county is recommending immediate euthanization for public safety." Maggie's nursing instincts screamed that something was wrong. "What kind of attack? Was the worker injured?" Marcus's hesitation lasted half a second too long. "Minor scratches. But the aggression is escalating. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is—" "I want to see the incident report." "That's confidential shelter business, ma'am." Maggie stepped closer, drawing on 4 decades of dealing with military bureaucrats who thought they could intimidate her with paperwork. "That dog is a decorated veteran who served this community for 6 years. The least you can do is show me the courtesy of transparency." Something flickered behind Marcus's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "I'll see what I can do. But Mrs. O'Sullivan, you need to understand that Rex isn't just old or unwanted. He's dangerous. Yesterday he nearly—" A deep, rumbling growl cut through Marcus's words. Both humans turned toward Rex's kennel, where the German shepherd had raised his head for the first time since Maggie's arrival. But Rex wasn't looking at her. His dark eyes were fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made the hair on Maggie's arms stand up. This wasn't random aggression. This was recognition. Marcus took an involuntary step backward. "See? He's completely unstable." But Maggie was watching Rex's body language with the eye of someone who had spent years reading the subtle signs of trauma in her patients. The dog's ears were forward, not back. His hackles weren't raised. This wasn't fear or madness. This was a trained police dog identifying a threat. "When exactly did Officer Coleman die?" Maggie asked, her voice steady despite the ice forming in her veins. "I don't see how that's relevant." 18 months ago, wasn't it? Right around the time you started working here?" Marcus's professional mask slipped completely. "Ma'am, I think you should leave." "Visiting hours are not until I understand why a decorated K-9 officer is being treated like a rabid animal." Maggie pulled out her phone and showed Marcus the screen, where Danny's text messages detailed Rex's service record. 47 successful rescues, 12 felony arrests, 3 commendations for valor. This dog has saved more lives than most humans ever will. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant barking from the main kennels. Rex remained alert, his intelligent eyes tracking every movement Marcus made. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Heroes can become villains, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Sometimes the things that make someone good at their job, sometimes those same things make them dangerous when they break." There was something in the way he said break that made Maggie's chest tighten. She had heard that exact inflection before, from administrators who had written off Harold as irreparably damaged, from doctors who suggested that sometimes the kindest option was to simply let the wounded fade away quietly. "I want to adopt him," Maggie said, the words surprising even herself. Marcus blinked. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand the liability." "I understand perfectly." Maggie reached into her purse and pulled out Harold's insurance check, still undeposited after 12 months. "I have $8,000 cash. I want Rex and I want him today. The adoption fee is only $500. The rest is for his medical care, PTSD treatment, behavioral therapy, whatever he needs." She looked directly at Marcus, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had once given orders in surgical tents while mortars fell around them. "Unless there's some reason you don't want to see this dog get the help he deserves." Marcus stared at the check, then at Rex, then back at Maggie. For a moment, something raw and angry flashed across his features, something that made Maggie think of Harold's worst nights, when the nightmares turned him into someone she barely recognized. "I'll need to check with county regulations," Marcus said finally. "A dog with Rex's history, there might be special requirements." As he walked away, Maggie noticed how Rex's entire body relaxed the moment Marcus disappeared from view. The dog's breathing became less labored, his posture less rigid. It was the same response she'd seen in trauma patients when their triggers were removed from the environment. She knelt back down beside the kennel, extending her hand slowly through the bars. This time, Rex didn't just acknowledge her presence. He shifted closer, his wet nose barely touching her fingertips, a gesture so tentative and hopeful it nearly broke her heart. "It's going to be okay, boy," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was comforting Rex or herself. "Whatever happened to you, whatever they did, we're going to figure this out together." Behind them, she could hear Marcus on the phone in his office, his voice too low to make out words, but carrying an urgency that made her wonder exactly what kind of special requirements he was discussing. The breakthrough came on Thursday morning, but not in the way Maggie had expected. She arrived at the shelter to find Rex standing at the front of his kennel for the first time since she'd met him, his ears alert and focused on something only he could hear. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the animal behavioral therapist Maggie had hired with Harold's insurance money, was setting up her equipment in the adjacent room when Rex suddenly began pacing, a behavior that hadn't been documented in his file for over 6 months. "That's remarkable," Dr. Hayes murmured, watching Rex through the observation window. "Yesterday, he wouldn't even acknowledge my presence. Today, he's showing classic hypervigilance patterns. Something has triggered his protective instincts. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what had changed. Marcus wasn't at work today. According to the volunteer coordinator, he'd called in sick with food poisoning, but Rex's transformation suggested something far more significant than a manager's absence. "Dr. Hayes," Maggie said carefully, "in your experience, when a traumatized animal shows sudden behavioral changes like this, what does it usually indicate?" The younger woman adjusted her glasses, considering. Either the animal is preparing for a threat they perceive as imminent, or they're responding to the removal of a chronic stressor. Given Rex's military training, I'd say his instincts are telling him something we haven't recognized yet. The words hung in the air like a warning. Maggie thought about Marcus's reaction when she'd mentioned adopting Rex, the strange phone call he'd made, the way Rex's body language changed whenever Marcus appeared. Her 40 years of military nursing had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct was screaming that something was wrong. That afternoon, while Rex worked with Dr. Hayes on basic trust exercises, Maggie drove to the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Her nephew Danny met her in the parking lot, his deputy's uniform crisp despite the California heat. "Aunt Maggie, I pulled Rex's service record like you asked," he said, handing her a thick manila folder. "You need to see this before you get too attached to that dog." The file made for sobering reading. Rex had indeed been a decorated K-9 officer, but his final case had been a nightmare that ended careers and destroyed lives. Officer Jake Coleman, Rex's handler and partner, had been killed during a raid on a child trafficking ring operating out of a warehouse district. According to the official report, Rex had failed to alert to danger, resulting in Jake walking into an ambush that cost him his life. But as Maggie read deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. The veterinary report noted that Rex had been found with a gunshot wound to his shoulder, evidence that he hadn't been hiding during the firefight, but had taken a bullet while trying to protect his partner. Witness statements described Rex staying with Jake's body despite continued gunfire, refusing to leave even when backup arrived. "Danny," Maggie said slowly, "who was the supervising officer on this case?" Her nephew checked his notes. "Sergeant Marcus Wheeler. He's the one who made the recommendation to retire Rex from service, said the dog was too traumatized to be reliable." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Marcus hadn't taken the shelter job by coincidence. He was Rex's former supervisor, and somehow, Rex's presence was connected to more than just inconvenient memories. That evening, Maggie made a decision that would have horrified her children if they'd known. She drove back to the shelter after hours, using the volunteer key card the staff had given her, and let herself into the isolation wing. Rex was awake, standing at attention in his kennel as if he'd been expecting her. "We need to talk, boy," she said softly, settling onto the concrete floor outside his kennel. "I think we're both in more trouble than we realized." She pulled out Jake Coleman's photo from the police file and held it where Rex could see. The dog's reaction was immediate and devastating. He pressed himself against the kennel bars, whining softly, the first sound she'd heard him make. His tail began to wag, slowly at first, then with increasing intensity as he recognized his lost partner's face. "You loved him," Maggie whispered, tears burning her eyes. "And they blamed you for not being able to save him." Rex's response shattered her heart. The massive German Shepherd began to shake, not with fear but with grief so profound it seemed to emanate from his very bones. Maggie had seen the same response in soldiers who survived when their battle buddies didn't. The crushing weight of survivor's guilt that no amount of logic could lift. She was so focused on Rex's emotional breakthrough that she almost missed the sound of footsteps in the main corridor. Almost. Her military training kicked in as she quickly pocketed Jake's photo and moved away from Rex's kennel, but she wasn't fast enough. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression cycling rapidly from surprise to suspicion to something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "Mrs. O'Sullivan? Working late? I wanted to spend time with Rex before the adoption paperwork goes through tomorrow," she said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "I hope that's acceptable." Marcus stepped into the room, and Maggie noticed he was wearing latex gloves, unusual for an evening visit. "About that adoption, I'm afraid there's been a complication. The county veterinarian wants to do additional behavioral testing before any placement can be approved." "What kind of testing?" "Stress response evaluation. It requires sedation. Heavy sedation." Marcus pulled a syringe from his jacket pocket, the clear liquid inside catching the fluorescent light. "For everyone's safety." Rex erupted. The sound that came from his throat wasn't a bark. It was a battle cry, the vocalization of a trained police dog identifying an immediate threat. He threw himself against the kennel door with such force that the metal frame shook, his powerful body focused entirely on getting to Marcus. "See?" Marcus said, but his voice was shaking now. "Completely unstable." This is exactly the kind of episode that makes him too dangerous for civilian placement. But Maggie was watching Rex's eyes, and what she saw there wasn't madness. It was recognition, intelligence, and something that made her stomach drop to her shoes. Rex wasn't reacting to a stranger. He was reacting to an enemy. "Marcus," she said quietly, "what exactly happened the night Jake Coleman died?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Marcus's hand tightened on the syringe as Rex continued his desperate assault on the kennel door, and Maggie realized with crystal clarity that she had stumbled into something far more dangerous than she'd imagined. This wasn't about an unwanted dog or an overcrowded shelter. This was about secrets that someone was willing to kill to keep buried. "I think you should leave, Mrs. O'Sullivan," Marcus said, and for the first time his professional mask had completely fallen away. Now. But Maggie O'Sullivan had faced down enemy artillery in Saigon and held dying boys' hands while hospitals shook from mortar fire. She wasn't about to be intimidated by a man with a syringe and a guilty conscience. "I think I'll stay," she said, pulling out her cell phone. "In fact, I think it's time to call my nephew Danny. He'd be very interested to hear about this behavioral testing protocol." Marcus lunged for her phone, and in that moment, everything changed. Rex's kennel door, weakened by his repeated assaults, finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal. 18 months of captivity, trauma, and suppressed protective instincts exploded as 100 pounds of highly trained German Shepherd launched himself between Maggie and the man who had been slowly poisoning him. The syringe flew across the room, shattering against the concrete wall as Marcus stumbled backward, Rex's powerful form driving him to the ground. But instead of mauling the man, Rex simply stood over him, every muscle tensed, a low growl rumbling from his chest, the controlled response of a police dog restraining a suspect. For the first time in 18 months, Rex was doing what he'd been born to do. He was protecting the innocent from the guilty. And in that moment, Maggie understood that everything Marcus had told her about Rex's instability had been a lie designed to keep anyone from looking too closely at why a decorated war hero was wasting away in isolation. "Good boy, Rex," she whispered, her voice shaking with adrenaline and something that felt dangerously like pride. "Now let's find out what this man has been hiding." As sirens wailed in the distance, Danny must have traced her location when she'd called. Maggie noticed something that made her blood run cold. The syringe Marcus had been carrying wasn't filled with sedative. The label on the broken vial read pentobarbital, the same drug used for euthanization. Marcus hadn't been planning to test Rex. He'd been planning to kill him. The warehouse reeked of blood, fear, and something else that made Rex's hackles rise. the metallic scent of weapons and violence that had haunted his nightmares for 18 months. Maggie crouched behind a stack of shipping containers, her arthritic knees screaming in protest as she watched Marcus Wheeler orchestrate what could only be described as a horror show designed for entertainment. 3 days had passed since Rex's dramatic rescue of her at the shelter. 3 days during which Danny's investigation had uncovered a network of corruption that reached deep into the county's animal control system. But none of them had expected this. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Riverside housed an illegal dog-fighting operation that made cockfighting look civilized. And Marcus Wheeler wasn't just a participant. He was the mastermind. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus's voice boomed over a crude PA system, "tonight's main event features our newest acquisition, a former police dog who's forgotten how to fight back." Maggie's heart stopped as she saw Rex being dragged into a makeshift arena, his powerful body moving with the sluggish coordination of heavy sedation. Even from her hiding spot 50 yards away, she could see the confusion in his dark eyes, the way his trained muscles struggled against whatever drugs Marcus had pumped into his system. Around the pit, men in expensive suits placed bets with the casual enthusiasm of spectators at a football game, their voices carrying across the warehouse with sickening clarity. "500 on the Rottweiler in under 10 minutes. That police dog looks half dead already. Easy money." Wheeler knows how to pick the guaranteed losers. The opponent being led into the arena made Maggie's stomach revolt. The Rottweiler mix was scarred from previous fights, his eyes holding the hollow madness of an animal that had been forced to kill or be killed too many times. This wasn't a fight. It was an execution disguised as entertainment. But Rex, even drugged and disoriented, wasn't cowering. His police training was stronger than the sedatives, and as the arena gates clanged shut, Maggie watched him assess his surroundings with the methodical precision of a tactical officer. His head turned slowly, cataloging exits, threats, and advantages with the same systematic approach that had once made him legendary in law enforcement. Marcus climbed onto a platform overlooking the pit, a wireless microphone in one hand and what appeared to be a cattle prod in the other. "This particular animal," he announced to the crowd, "cost a good man his life. Tonight we're going to see if he's learned any survival instincts during his vacation at taxpayer expense." The cruelty in his voice was so profound that several spectators shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't just about money or entertainment. This was personal revenge being served up as a spectacle, and Maggie realized with horrifying clarity that Marcus had been planning this moment since the day he'd taken the shelter job. Her phone buzzed with a text from Danny. "SWAT team in position. Stay hidden until we move. Do not try to help." But as she watched Marcus raise the cattle prod toward Rex, who was struggling to maintain his footing against the sedatives, Maggie O'Sullivan made the same decision she'd made 47 years earlier when mortars were falling on her field hospital. Some things mattered more than personal safety. She stood up from behind the shipping containers and shouted at the top of her lungs, "Rex! Officer down! Officer down!" The effect was instantaneous and electric. Rex's head snapped toward her voice, his cloudy eyes suddenly sharp and focused. The police command phrase cut through his drug-induced haze like a blade, triggering muscle memory and training that no amount of trauma could erase. In that moment, he wasn't a broken shelter dog. He was K-9 Officer Rex, responding to a crisis. The arena erupted into chaos. Marcus spun toward Maggie's position, his face contorted with rage, while spectators began shouting and scrambling for exits. But Rex was already moving, his powerful legs finding traction on the blood-stained concrete as years of tactical training overrode everything else. "You interfering old bitch!" Marcus screamed, vaulting over the arena barrier with surprising agility. "You have no idea what you've done!" But he had made a fatal tactical error. In his rage, he had turned his back on a trained police dog who had just remembered exactly what he was capable of. Rex moved like lightning despite the sedatives, his massive frame colliding with Marcus's legs and sending the cattle prod spinning across the warehouse floor. The two went down hard, Marcus's scream of surprise and pain echoing off the metal walls as 100 pounds of highly trained German Shepherd pinned him to the concrete. "Don't move," Rex's positioning seemed to say, his teeth bared inches from Marcus's throat. "I am a police officer, and you are under arrest." The warehouse exploded with the sound of boots on concrete as Danny's SWAT team poured through every entrance simultaneously. "Police! Everyone on the ground! Now!" Maggie watched from her position behind the containers as the operation unfolded with military precision. The spectators, doctors, lawyers, businessmen who had come to watch animals tear each other apart for entertainment, dropped to their knees with their hands visible. Cash and betting slips scattered like confetti, as men who had been cheering for blood moments earlier now begged for mercy from the same law enforcement community they'd been mocking. But Rex never moved from his position over Marcus. Even as flashlights blazed around him, even as officers shouted commands and suspects were cuffed, the German Shepherd maintained his arrest hold with the professionalism of an officer who had never forgotten his oath to serve and protect. "That's my boy," Maggie whispered, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood what everyone else had missed. Rex hadn't failed to save Jake Coleman. Rex had been trying to arrest the man who killed him. Danny appeared at her side, his deputies training warring with obvious concern for his elderly aunt. "Maggie, what the hell are you doing here? I told you to stay away." "That dog," she said, pointing to where Rex still held Marcus in perfect police custody, "isn't broken, Danny. He's been trying to solve Jake Coleman's murder for 18 months and nobody would listen." As if summoned by her words, Detective Sarah Martinez from the county's Major Crimes Unit approached Rex with the careful respect one officer shows another. "Easy, partner," she said softly, producing a standard police leash. "We've got him now. You can stand down." Rex looked at her, then at Marcus, then slowly, reluctantly, stepped back and allowed himself to be leashed. But his eyes never left Marcus's face, and the low growl rumbling in his chest suggested that 18 months of suppressed justice was finally demanding to be heard. Marcus, pinned beneath Rex's weight until the last second, struggled to his feet with blood seeping from bite marks on his arms. His professional mask had completely shattered, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. "That animal is dangerous. He attacked me unprovoked. I want him destroyed immediately." "Funny thing about that," Detective Martinez said, pulling out her handcuffs with deliberate slowness. "We've been investigating reports of missing K-9 officers for 6 months. Dogs that were supposedly euthanized for behavioral problems but whose bodies were never found. Dogs whose former handlers have been asking uncomfortable questions." Marcus's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Marcus Wheeler, you're under arrest for animal cruelty, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit fraud." The detective's voice was professionally calm, but Maggie could hear the disgust underneath. "You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect you've got a lot of explaining to do about where 18 missing police dogs ended up." As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, shouting protests about his rights and his service record, Rex finally allowed his legs to buckle. The sedatives and adrenaline crash hit him simultaneously, and he collapsed onto the warehouse floor with a whimper that cut through Maggie's heart like a blade. She was beside him in seconds, her hands running over his massive frame as she checked for injuries. "It's okay, boy. You did it. You got the bad guy." Rex's tail gave a weak wag, and for the first time since she'd met him, his eyes held something that looked like peace. the ghosts that had been haunting him for 18 months. The failure to save Jake, the guilt of surviving, the confusion of being blamed for a tragedy he couldn't prevent, were finally being laid to rest. Dr. Hayes knelt beside them, her professional demeanor cracking as she witnessed the emotional breakthrough. "Maggie, what you just saw, that wasn't just a traumatized dog. That was a police officer finishing his last case." Around them, the warehouse investigation continued. Federal agents were documenting evidence of an interstate dog fighting ring that had generated over $2 million in illegal gambling revenue. Computer records showed that Marcus had been systematically identifying retired police and military dogs with PTSD, claiming they were unadoptable due to behavioral issues, then selling them to fighting promoters who valued their training and resilience. But the most damning evidence was found in Marcus's personal files. Detailed records of Rex's daily condition, photographs documenting his deterioration, and what appeared to be a timeline for his planned introduction to the fighting circuit. At the bottom of the file, in Marcus's handwriting, was a note that made Detective Martinez's jaw clench. "This one owes me for Jake. Make it hurt." "Ma'am," Danny said, approaching Maggie with obvious reluctance, "we need to take Rex as evidence. The federal prosecutor wants him examined by their veterinary team and—" "No!" Maggie's voice carried the authority of someone who had once told generals that their wounded soldiers weren't ready for transport. "Rex has been evidence long enough. He's going home." "Aunt Maggie, I understand your attachment, but—" "Deputy," she interrupted, standing slowly with Rex leaning heavily against her legs, "this dog just solved a federal case and exposed a corruption ring that your department missed for 6 months. I think he's earned the right to sleep in a real bed tonight." The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. Detective Martinez was smiling as she approached with a clipboard in her hands. "Actually, Mrs. O'Sullivan, there's precedent for releasing evidence animals to qualified handlers when public safety isn't at risk, and given Rex's service record—" She looked down at the German Shepherd, who was now standing at attention despite his exhaustion. "I think this officer has earned his pension." As they loaded Rex into Maggie's car, gently, with the respect due a decorated veteran, she caught sight of Marcus being processed by federal agents. He was shouting something about his service record, his sacrifices, his right to justice for Jake's death. But his words were lost in the chaos of his arrest, and Rex never looked back. "Come on, hero," Maggie whispered as Rex settled into the passenger seat of her Honda Civic, his massive head resting against the window. "Let's go home and start healing the right way." For the first time in 18 months, Rex's tail wagged with something that looked like hope. And for the first time since Harold's death, Maggie felt like she might actually be able to save someone who needed saving. The drive home was quiet except for Rex's steady breathing and the distant sound of sirens as more law enforcement arrived at the warehouse. In her rearview mirror, Maggie could see the flashing lights fading into the distance, along with the nightmare that had held both of them prisoner for far too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: Rex's recovery, the media attention, the federal trial where they would both need to testify. But tonight, all that mattered was getting this broken warrior to a safe place where his wounds could finally begin to heal. "Harold would have liked you," she told Rex as they pulled into her driveway. "He always said the best soldiers were the ones who never stopped fighting for what was right, even when the world stopped believing in them." Rex lifted his head and looked at her with eyes that were finally, after 18 months of darkness, beginning to remember what trust felt like. The call came at 3:17 in the morning, shattering the first peaceful sleep Rex had experienced in 18 months. Maggie jerked awake to find the German Shepherd standing rigid beside her bed, his ears pinned forward in the alert posture she'd learned meant imminent danger. Her phone continued its shrill demand for attention as she fumbled for her glasses, but Rex was already moving toward the front door with the focused intensity of a dog who recognized a specific threat. "Danny?" she answered, her voice thick with sleep and growing dread. "Aunt Maggie, you need to get out of there, now." Her nephew's voice carried the controlled panic of a law enforcement officer delivering bad news. "Marcus Wheeler made bail an hour ago. Federal judge accepted his lawyer's argument that he posed no flight risk." Maggie's blood turned to ice water. "How is that possible? He was caught red-handed running a high-powered attorney, clean service record, no priors." Judge bought the argument that he was just a middle manager following orders from higher up. Danny's frustration bled through the phone connection. His lawyer claims the real organizers used Marcus as a fall guy, threatened his family if he didn't cooperate. Rex had positioned himself between Maggie and the front door, his massive body coiled like a spring. Even in the darkness, she could see the familiar hypervigilance that Dr. Hayes had warned her about, the state where Rex's PTSD and police training created a dangerous cocktail of heightened awareness and potential violence. Where is he now? That's the problem. He's not at his registered address, not at his known associates. "Maggie, this man has been planning something for 18 months. He's not going to just disappear and start over somewhere else." The house creaked around them, settling into the night sounds that had once comforted her but now seemed ominous. Rex's low growl began deep in his chest, a warning that made Maggie's military-trained instincts scream that they were no longer safe in her own home. "I'm not running, Danny. This is my house, Harold's house. We didn't retreat from the Viet Cong, and I'm not retreating from some bitter ex-cop with a grudge. Aunt Maggie, please, take Rex and come to the station. We can protect—" The line went dead. Not disconnected. Cut. Maggie stared at her phone as the screen flickered and died, despite showing a full battery charge just moments before. Rex's growl intensified, and she realized with sick certainty that Marcus hadn't just made bail. He was here. The power cut followed seconds later, plunging the house into darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. Rex moved closer to her, his warm body pressed against her legs, and she could feel the tremors running through his powerful frame. Not fear, anticipation. Every instinct he possessed was screaming that the enemy who had destroyed his life was finally within reach. "I know you're in there, Margaret." Marcus's voice drifted through the darkness from somewhere outside, amplified by a portable speaker that made it impossible to pinpoint his location. "You and that worthless dog cost me everything. My career, my reputation, my future. Time to balance the scales." Maggie's hand found Rex's collar, feeling the raised scars where his police tags had once hung. In the darkness, her fingers traced the familiar pattern of his service markings. 12 years of faithful service reduced to empty metal loops because one man couldn't accept responsibility for his own failures. "Jake Coleman was my brother-in-law," Marcus continued, his voice now coming from a different direction. He was circling the house, using psychological warfare tactics that suggested military training. "Good man, devoted father, married to my sister. When he died, because that animal failed to do his job, it destroyed my family." Rex's body language shifted subtly, and Maggie realized he was no longer just responding to a threat. He was hunting. Despite the PTSD, despite 18 months of trauma and forced inactivity, the core programming that made him an elite K-9 officer was reasserting itself. Marcus had made a critical tactical error. He had cornered a police dog in the presence of someone the dog was bonded to protect. "The federal prosecutor thinks she's got a case against me," Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker, now seemingly from the backyard. "But what she doesn't know is that every dog I sold to the fighting rings was already damaged goods. Rex isn't the first police dog to crack under pressure, and he won't be the last." The admission hung in the night air like a confession. Maggie pulled out her backup phone, an old flip model Danny had insisted she keep for emergencies, and began recording. If they didn't survive the night, at least Marcus's words would serve as evidence. "You want to know what really happened the night Jake died?" Marcus's voice was getting closer, more intimate, as if he was right outside the living room window. That dog saw the ambush coming. He could have warned Jake, could have saved him. Instead, he froze like the coward he is. Rex's response was immediate and devastating. The growl that emerged from his throat wasn't the random aggression of a traumatized animal. It was the controlled warning of a police dog identifying a lie. And in that moment, Maggie understood that everything they thought they knew about Jake Coleman's death was wrong. "You're lying," she called out into the darkness, her voice carrying 40 years of experience with men who used authority to hide their crimes. "Rex didn't fail to save Jake. You failed to save Jake." The silence that followed was so profound she could hear Rex's controlled breathing beside her. Then Marcus's voice returned, but now it carried something different. The raw edge of a man whose carefully constructed justifications were crumbling. "That dog remembers things he shouldn't remember, sees things he shouldn't have seen. Tonight, we're going to make sure his memory problems become permanent." The sound of breaking glass came from the kitchen, followed by the unmistakable odor of gasoline. Marcus wasn't just planning to kill them. He was planning to destroy the evidence. And Rex, despite his trauma, despite his fear, despite 18 months of believing he was worthless, pressed closer to Maggie and prepared to do what he had always done: protect the innocent, no matter the cost. In the darkness, Maggie could hear Rex's breathing change from the ragged pattern of anxiety to the steady rhythm of a working dog preparing for action. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The truth came pouring out of Marcus Wheeler like poison from a lanced wound as federal agents secured the burning warehouse and paramedics worked to stabilize both Rex and Maggie from smoke inhalation. Cornered, his carefully constructed lies crumbling around him, Marcus finally revealed the secret that had driven him to 18 months of calculated revenge. "You want to know what really happened that night?" Marcus snarled from the back of the police cruiser, his hands cuffed behind him as Detective Martinez read him his rights. "Jake Coleman was supposed to die. The whole operation was supposed to go sideways. But that damn dog—" Maggie sat in the back of an ambulance, Rex's massive head resting on her lap as an EMT checked his vitals. The German Shepherd was conscious but exhausted, his breathing labored from the smoke and the sedatives still working through his system. Yet his dark eyes remained fixed on Marcus with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "Marcus Wheeler," Detective Martinez said slowly, "you're confessing to conspiracy to commit murder of a police officer?" The dam burst completely. Marcus's professional facade, his carefully maintained image of the grieving brother-in-law seeking justice, dissolved into the bitter ravings of a man who had been living with unbearable guilt for 18 months. "I was skimming from the drug seizure fund," he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "300,000 over 2 years. Jake found out. He was going to report me, destroy my career, ruin my family's reputation." Marcus's eyes found Rex through the ambulance window. "I set up the trafficking bus to look like an ambush, paid the dealers extra to make sure Jake didn't walk away." The silence that followed was broken only by Rex's soft whine, not of pain, but of validation. For 18 months he had carried the weight of failing to save his partner. Now the truth was finally emerging. Rex hadn't failed to protect Jake. Rex had discovered the betrayal. Detective Martinez leaned closer to the cruiser window. But Rex survived. "Rex saw me talking to the dealers beforehand. He knew something was wrong, kept trying to alert Jake, wouldn't let him enter the warehouse." Marcus's laugh was bitter and broken. "Damn dog was doing his job perfectly, so I had to improvise." Maggie felt Rex's body tense beneath her hands as Marcus continued his confession. The pieces of that horrible night were finally falling into place, and each revelation made the injustice of Rex's 18-month imprisonment more unbearable. "I shot Rex first, told Jake the dog was down and needed immediate medical attention. Got Jake to break protocol, enter without backup." Marcus's voice cracked. "But Rex wasn't as hurt as I thought. Even wounded, he tried to get between Jake and the dealers. Took 2 more bullets trying to drag Jake to safety." The EMT working on Rex paused, her hands gentle as she examined old scar tissue hidden beneath his thick coat. "This dog has 3 bullet wounds," she confirmed quietly. "Healed but significant. Shoulder, flank, and what looks like a graze across his skull. Rex hadn't failed to save Jake Coleman. Rex had taken 3 bullets trying to save Jake Coleman from a betrayal, orchestrated by the one man Jake trusted most. And for his heroism, he'd been labeled a coward and left to rot in a concrete cell." "Why blame the dog?" Detective Martinez asked, though Maggie could see she already knew the answer. "Dead dogs don't testify," Marcus said simply. "Dead dogs don't remember seeing their handler's supervisor talking to drug dealers." If Rex had died that night like he was supposed to, Jake's death would have been just another tragic loss in the line of duty. Federal Agent Rebecca Torres approached the ambulance with a file folder thick enough to choke a horse. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, we've been through the warehouse computers. This operation has been running for 3 years with total revenues exceeding $5 million. But Rex wasn't just another victim. He was the target Marcus had been building toward all along." She opened the folder to reveal photographs that made Maggie's stomach turn. Images of fighting rings, wounded animals, and betting pools with odds calculated based on which dogs would suffer the most before dying. At the bottom of the stack was a promotional flyer featuring Rex's photo with the headline, "Former Cop Killer Gets His Due." Marcus had been advertising Rex's appearance for 6 weeks, Agent Torres explained. The betting pools weren't just about whether he'd win or lose. They were taking bets on how long he'd survive against opponents specifically chosen to maximize his suffering. Rex lifted his head slightly, his intelligent eyes moving from Maggie to Agent Torres to the police cruiser where Marcus sat, ranting about his rights and his service record. And then, with the deliberate precision of a police dog filing a report, Rex stood up and walked slowly to the cruiser window. Marcus fell silent as Rex approached, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of the animal he'd tortured for 18 months. Rex sat in perfect police formation, back straight, head high, eyes focused, and delivered what could only be described as a silent testimony. The message was clear. "I remember everything. I know what you did, and I'm still here." "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, all color draining from his face. "He remembers. After all this time, he remembers the warehouse, the dealers, all of it." Agent Torres made notes on her clipboard. "Mr. Wheeler, are you saying Rex was a witness to your meeting with the trafficking ring before Officer Coleman's murder?" Marcus seemed to realize he was confessing to far more than animal cruelty. "I want a lawyer. I'm not saying anything else without a lawyer." But Rex wasn't finished. The German Shepherd rose from his sitting position and moved to where Jake Coleman's case file lay scattered on a nearby table. With the gentle precision of a dog trained to recover evidence, he picked up Jake's photograph in his mouth and carried it back to Maggie. Dr. Hayes, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, spoke for the first time since the arrests began. "In 20 years of animal behavioral therapy, I've never seen anything like this. Rex isn't just recovering from PTSD, he's been conducting his own investigation for 18 months. The photograph in Rex's mouth was creased and worn, as if it had been handled many times. Detective Martinez took it carefully, examining it under the crime scene lights. "Where did this come from?" Agent Torres checked her evidence log. Rex's personal effects from his police locker. It was the only item he was allowed to keep when he was retired. Maggie looked down at Rex, who had returned to his position beside her, and felt something shift in her chest. This magnificent animal hadn't just been surviving his trauma for 18 months. He'd been carrying evidence, protecting the memory of his fallen partner while the system that should have supported him tried to erase both of them. "Marcus Wheeler," Agent Torres said, approaching the police cruiser with handcuffs that looked substantially heavier than the ones he was already wearing. "You're now under arrest for the first-degree murder of police officer Jake Coleman. These are federal charges, Mr. Wheeler. There won't be any bail this time." As Marcus was transferred to federal custody, screaming denials that no one believed anymore, Rex finally allowed himself to collapse against Maggie's legs. The weight of 18 months of carrying impossible secrets, of being blamed for a crime he'd tried to prevent, of believing himself a failure when he was actually a hero, all of it seemed to drain out of him at once. "It's over, boy," Maggie whispered, her fingers finding the spot behind his ears that made his eyes drift closed with relief. "You solved the case. You got justice for Jake. You can rest now." For the first time since Officer Jake Coleman had died in his arms, Rex allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was still one of the good guys. 6 months later, Maggie O'Sullivan stood in the sunlit lobby of Harold's Haven K-9 Recovery Center, watching Rex demonstrate something that 3 federal prosecutors had declared impossible: a dog with severe PTSD successfully comforting a traumatized veteran. The German Shepherd lay perfectly still as Army Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez, home from his 3rd tour in Afghanistan, buried his face in Rex's thick coat and sobbed for the first time since his convoy had been hit by an IED outside Kandahar. "Some days, I can't even remember why I wanted to come home," Tommy whispered to Rex, his words muffled against the dog's fur. "Everything I touch turns to ash." Rex responded with the patient stillness that had become his signature. No movement, no reaction, just solid, unwavering presence. It was the same technique he'd used with Maggie during her own dark nights, when Harold's absence felt like a physical wound that would never heal. Somehow, this broken dog had become a master of healing others by simply being present for their pain. The irony wasn't lost on Maggie. Rex, who had been condemned as too damaged to serve, was now the most successful therapy animal in California's Veteran Support Network. The federal grant money that funded Harold's Haven had come directly from the seized assets of Marcus Wheeler's dogfighting operation. Over $2 million that was now being used to heal the very animals it had once been used to destroy. Dr. Jennifer Hayes approached with Rex's daily evaluation report, her expression radiating the quiet satisfaction of a therapist who had witnessed the impossible. "Maggie, I need to show you something remarkable. Rex's stress indicators have dropped to normal ranges for the first time since we started treating him. But more importantly, his protective instincts have recalibrated. He's not hyper-vigilant anymore, he's selectively alert." Through the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows, Maggie could see the memorial garden she'd created in Harold's honor. Rex spent an hour there every morning, sitting beside Harold's gravestone, as if reporting for duty to a commanding officer he'd never met but somehow understood. The ritual had started spontaneously 3 months earlier, and Maggie had stopped questioning the mystical logic of grief and healing. "Dr. Hayes, there's something I need to tell you," Maggie said, her voice carrying the weight of a decision she'd been contemplating for weeks. "The federal prosecutor called yesterday. Marcus Wheeler wants to make a deal." The younger woman's eyebrows rose. "What kind of deal?" "Full confession to Jake Coleman's murder, cooperation with the interstate trafficking investigation, testimony against his co-conspirators." Maggie paused, watching Rex guide Tommy through a breathing exercise they'd developed together. in exchange for a reduced sentence and protection in federal prison. That's wonderful news. Justice for Officer Coleman, closure for his family. There's a condition. Maggie's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Marcus wants Rex present during his confession. He claims there are details about Jake's death that only Rex witnessed, things that could help convict the trafficking ring's leadership. Dr. Hayes went very still. Maggie, exposing Rex to Marcus again could undo months of progress. The trauma response could be catastrophic. I know. Maggie watched as Rex somehow sensed Tommy's breathing had steadied and gradually shifted position to allow the young veteran to sit up straighter. But Rex deserves the chance to speak for Jake one last time, even if we're the only ones who understand his language. The decision had kept her awake for 3 nights running. Rex had finally found peace, purpose, and a mission that utilized his training without triggering his trauma. The therapy work was healing him as much as it helped his patients, and the waiting list of veterans requesting Rex's assistance stretched 6 months into the future. Asking him to face Marcus again felt like a betrayal of everything they'd built together. But Jake Coleman's widow had called 2 days earlier, her voice breaking as she explained what closure would mean to her children. My kids need to know their father died a hero, not because of some dog's failure. If Rex can help prove what really happened, please, Mrs. O'Sullivan, Jake deserves the truth. The doorbell chimed, interrupting Maggie's internal debate. Through the glass doors, she saw a familiar figure approaching. Elena Coleman, Jake's widow, accompanied by 2 teenagers who shared their father's dark hair and serious eyes. They had driven 4 hours from San Diego for this visit, hoping to meet the dog who had tried to save their father's life. Rex's reaction to the Coleman family had been nothing short of miraculous during their first meeting 3 months earlier. The moment Jake's scent registered from clothing Elena had brought, Rex had transformed from therapy dog to grieving partner, pressing his massive body against Elena's legs and keening softly. The same sound he'd made when Jake had died in his arms. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Elena said as she entered the lobby, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. The children wanted to see Rex before we give our answer about the confession. 16-year-old Michael Coleman approached Rex with the cautious respect teenagers usually reserve for authority figures. Mom says you tried to save Dad. Rex looked up at the boy with those intelligent dark eyes, then slowly rose and moved to a position that Maggie had come to recognize. He sat at attention, back straight, head high, not the relaxed posture of a therapy dog, but the formal stance of a police officer presenting himself for inspection. He's saluting, whispered Jake's daughter, Sarah, 14 and small for her age. Just like Dad taught us. Elena's composure cracked as Rex maintained his position, offering Jake's children the respect their father had taught him to show to family members of fallen officers. He remembers, she said through tears. After all this time, he still remembers the protocol. Dr. Hayes documented the interaction with quiet amazement. Rex's ability to shift between therapy mode and police mode suggested a level of emotional intelligence that challenged everything the textbook said about canine PTSD recovery. He wasn't just healing, he was integrating his trauma into a new understanding of his purpose. Mrs. Coleman, Maggie said gently, whatever you and the children decide about the confession, Rex will respect. But I need you to know, he blames himself for not saving Jake. He's carried that guilt for 18 months. Elena knelt beside Rex and spoke directly to him, her voice carrying the authority of a police widow who understood the weight of service. Rex, Jake knew you tried. Before he died, he told the paramedics that you took bullets meant for him. He died knowing you were a hero. The German Shepherd's response was immediate and heartbreaking. He lowered his head and placed it in Elena's hands, his powerful body shaking with what could only be described as relief. The official police report had never mentioned Jake's final words, but Elena's confirmation seemed to lift a burden Rex had been carrying since that terrible night. Young Michael Coleman sat down beside Rex and did something that surprised everyone in the room. He pulled out his phone and showed Rex a video. Jake in uniform, teaching a younger Rex to search for drugs during training exercises. "This was from Dad's police academy graduation," Michael explained. "He always said you were the smartest dog he'd ever worked with, said you saved his life at least a dozen times before." Rex watched the video with an intensity that made Maggie's chest tight. On the small screen, a younger, healthier Rex performed flawless searches while Jake praised his work with obvious pride. The dog they were watching bore little resemblance to the broken animal Marcus had tried to destroy, that Rex had been confident, playful, eager to work. "I want to testify," Sarah Coleman said suddenly, her young voice carrying surprising steel. "If Rex facing Marcus will help put him away forever, then we should do it. Dad would want justice, not just for himself, but for all the other dogs Marcus hurt." Elena nodded slowly. "The prosecutor said Rex wouldn't have to be in the same room with Marcus. They can use video testimony, one-way glass. Rex would be protected." Dr. Hayes cleared her throat. "There's something else to consider. Rex's recovery has been remarkable, but it's built on routine and safety. Disrupting that equilibrium, even for justice, carries real risks." Maggie looked down at Rex, who had moved from Elena's hands to sit directly in front of her. His dark eyes met hers with an expression she'd come to recognize. The look he gave her when he sensed she was struggling with Harold's memory, when he somehow knew she needed his steady presence to anchor her to the present. "What do you think, boy?" she asked softly. "Are you ready to be a police dog one more time?" Rex's response was unambiguous. He stood, walked to the wall where his old service collar hung in a place of honor, and sat beneath it in perfect police formation. The message was clear. He was ready to serve. The federal courthouse 3 weeks later was packed with media, law enforcement officials, and animal rights advocates who had followed Rex's story since the warehouse raid. But in the secure witness room, surrounded by bulletproof glass and armed guards, there were only 5 beings present: Rex, Maggie, Dr. Hayes, federal prosecutor Amanda Chen, and a video monitor showing Marcus Wheeler in the main courtroom. Rex had undergone weeks of preparation for this moment, gradual desensitization to courtroom environments and legal procedures. But nothing could have prepared Maggie for his reaction when Marcus appeared on the monitor. The German Shepherd didn't cower or show aggression. Instead, he assumed a position Maggie had never seen before. Alert but relaxed, professional but ready, the stance of a police dog prepared to give testimony. "Mr. Wheeler?" Prosecutor Chen's voice came through the speakers. "The defendant Rex is present via video link. Do you maintain your claim that this animal failed to protect Officer Coleman?" Marcus looked directly into the camera, his eyes finding Rex's through the electronic connection. What passed between them was electric. 18 months of lies meeting the unwavering truth of a witness who had never forgotten. "No," Marcus said finally, his voice barely audible. "Rex tried to warn Jake. He tried to stop me. Everything that happened that night, Rex was the only one trying to do the right thing." Rex's tail began to wag, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. Not the frantic happiness of a dog seeking approval, but the measured satisfaction of a police officer whose testimony had just secured a conviction. As Marcus Wheeler was led away to begin a life sentence without possibility of parole, Rex stood and approached the camera. He placed his nose against the glass and gave one short bark, the same sound Jake Coleman had taught him to make when a case was officially closed. Justice, 18 months delayed, had finally been served. This story reminds us that heroes don't have expiration dates. And sometimes the most profound purpose comes when we think our useful days are behind us. Maggie O'Sullivan could have spent her golden years in quiet retirement, accepting that her days of saving lives were over. Instead, at 68, she chose to see worth in a broken warrior that society had written off as damaged goods. Like so many of us who've watched loved ones struggle with invisible wounds, Maggie understood that healing isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about finding new ways to serve with the wisdom our scars have given us. Rex's transformation from forgotten shelter dog to celebrated therapy animal proves that second chances aren't just for the young. They're for anyone brave enough to believe they still have something valuable to offer the world. In a culture that often discards what it perceives as past its prime, this story celebrates the truth that our most meaningful contributions often come after we've learned what real loss feels like. Sometimes the broken pieces fit together in ways that create something stronger than the original. Have you ever felt like society had written you off as past your prime? What would you do if you found your own Rex? Someone or something that others had given up on but you knew still had value to offer?